Okay, well thanks. It's great to be here and good to see some familiar faces. I should mention Fred McCoy because a lot of my research before this is actually on entrepreneurship and innovation. That's kind of what got me interested in economics to begin with. So I have a PhD in business economics from UC Berkeley. I grew up in upstate New York and came down here to Duke 11 years ago in 2006. It was my first job out of grad school. And in academia, you don't always expect that to be your last job, but the way it's going, and my wife and 3 kids would agree, I think we're here for the long term. So it's been really fun to get to know the community more. We live over in Durham, but my wife works for a tech company in Cary, so we spend a lot of time over in the Raleigh-Cary area as well. I didn't really sort of start off doing work in this at the very beginning. Most of my work is trying to understand how the economy relates to, or economic factors relate to entrepreneurship and innovation, people starting new businesses, coming up with new ideas. And I use my economic training to sort of understand that. But I'm also pretty passionate about these business and society issues, and I think I've taken a lot of lead from that from my students. And I'll talk to you about a class I'm teaching right now at Duke to my students on business and politics in the age of Trump. And I'll give you a sense of like what they're thinking about and the questions they're asking. I think you'll find it very interesting. I should also recognize John Hood, who has spent some time at Duke, and him and Leslie Winter are part of a great program to just bring more reasonable discussions and debates about these difficult issues into the classroom. It's not always easy, as you all know, and so I've really benefited from having John around. Had lunch with him and Leslie when I was developing this class. They gave me some good advice to a professor, from folks on the outside, saying, you're probably trying to do too much in this class. And so it turned out I was, John, so we'll get to that at the end. I'm right about 1%. Right. On that one, you were right, so that's great. And let me talk a little bit about CEO activism and how this all started and what my view is. I want to discuss the phenomenon. So my work has really been trying to figure out why. This seems to be happening more often. I'll talk a little bit about what it is I mean by the phenomenon and how I'm measuring happening more often. And these things are all up in the air. I mean, besides me and my co-author, Mike Toffel at Harvard Business School, very few people are writing kind of academic articles about this. The media is writing a lot about it, but very few academics are writing about it. So I'll tell you a little bit about my perspective and why we jumped on that. If we have time, I will love to share with you this new course I have at Duke on business and politics and get your advice and counsel on it. It's been a really interesting experience trying to give my students what I hope is a broad perspective on this issue and many, many others. And I'll show you a little bit of the material we use for that. And hopefully some of the suggestions will be useful as I teach the class next year. I've now finished it, but we'll be doing it again next year. And I also want to note, I know everyone politely waits till the end for the last 10 minutes. This is such an interesting topic. A lot of people have opinions on it. I certainly don't mind if you want to raise your hand and we can interject at any point during the talk. If at some point I feel like I really want to get to some piece of information that's super important, I can politely ask to go on. But honestly, I'm here just to engage on the topic, and it's not rocket science. It's not a super complex phenomenon. So I can give you the introduction, and we can just talk, and I'll tell you what I've learned from my experience. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay. So this is where I started. In 2015, I noticed that Tim Cook, who was mentioned earlier, was speaking out about Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And we all live in North Carolina, so we later lived through the whole HB2 thing. But RFRA was one of the forerunners here, a religious liberty bill signed by then Governor Mike Pence. I can't remember what happened to him. I think he went on to bigger and better things, but it was Governor Mike Pence. And as you recall, Tim Cook tweeted and wrote a Washington Post editorial in 2015 weighing in against RFRA. And it was in November of the previous year that Mr. Cook had come out as gay on the cover of Bloomberg Businessweek. So he'd been getting a lot of attention around that, and then speaking out about Indiana's RFRA law. And what's really interesting to me at the time is I'm not too old. I haven't been doing this for a long time, but I thought this seems kind of new to me. I'd learned a lot about corporate social responsibility programs. These efforts that companies are doing to green their supply chain or invest in diversity or improve corporate governance. I was very familiar with that. What I wasn't familiar with was companies as much directly and kind of in an outspoken manner tweeting or writing op-eds, particularly about states that they didn't have huge operations in. There are Apple stores in Indiana. Some of them are owned by Apple. Some of them probably managed by outside companies. But it wasn't as if this was an issue in Cupertino, California, the headquarters. This was in Indiana. And you all know what happened after that, right? We all kind of follow the same news. Tremendous back and forth. A bunch of other CEOs, including Mark Benioff from Salesforce, who's right here. Bill Osterley, who's the CEO of Angie's List, or was the CEO of Angie's List. And interestingly, a top aide to Governor Mitch Daniels, former Governor Mitch Daniels. So Osterley, a Republican, very committed to LGBT rights, came out also and said, we're going to not plan our expansion to be in Indiana anymore over this. And so you start to see economic power being levered as well, which I thought was interesting. And of course, about a week later, Mike Pence signed a revised version of the bill. Like HB2, sides disagree. Is this a revision? Is it a retraction? Is it, all that stuff. But there was a new bill that they signed a week later. So I started to sense in 2015 that something interesting was going on that I wanted to learn more about. And Howard Schultz had already been speaking out about race in the aftermath of Ferguson, Missouri, but even before that. And you remember his Race Together campaign. I don't know if anyone went to Starbucks during that time, but the idea was you should write race together in your coffee cups and start this conversation about race. What I found interesting about that is there's some great segments about, actually from folks, millennials, people on the left saying, this is a really complicated conversation to have with your barista at 7:30 in the morning. So, it kind of fell flat, and they ended up not talking about that after a week. But it was interesting. They got blowback from a different group, I think, than they expected, which is a real interesting key to this when you think about companies like Dick's Clothing and Sporting Goods, Walmart, Kroger, recently with the guns issue. Sheryl Sandberg, a little bit different, COO. She's been speaking out at Facebook, of course, about gender equality and her Lean In campaign. That's been getting a lot of attention. Then we have John Mackey from Whole Foods, who spoke out about the Affordable Care Act, has written a couple op-eds and was posting on message boards about that. Dan Cathy at Chick-fil-A, speaking out in defense of traditional marriage. That made a lot of news. Lloyd Blankfein was one of the first CEOs of any company, Goldman Sachs, my old employer, first of any company that I remember to kind of, in 2012, to speak out for same-sex marriage, also on the Paris Accords. He's also spoken out more recently that we should get back in. So a bunch of CEOs talking about a bunch of issues that I hadn't heard them talking about before. And I thought about it in the following way. I think they're speaking out on social, political, and economic issues that are arguably indirectly related to the core business. The reason, as an academic, I have to be very careful with this kind of thing, if I say they're totally unrelated, then somebody in a seminar will stand up and say, well, when you hire people, they care about your mission, your brand, your identity. So your values might be related to who you hire, which might be related to the economics. And so as an academic, it's true. I can't say it's totally unrelated. On the other hand, I don't think they're directly in the core business, right, of what these companies do. So that's why I've chosen the kind of squeamy word indirectly. So that's where this comes from, okay? But I would say this is a different set of issues than they were speaking about before. So in 2015, I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review about the Race Together campaign and the potential upside for companies from CEO activism with my co-author, Michael Toffel. At the time, we had proposed a magazine article about this. We thought this was a huge phenomenon. It was going to get a lot bigger. We wanted to understand it. Our position here was to explain what the possible benefits, and it doesn't turn out in the title, but also costs of CEO activism could be. And they said, we're not interested in the magazine article. We would like to have a digital piece. We just don't think this thing is going to become that big of a deal. And which is interesting. But at the time, the typical reader of Harvard Business Review is a CEO, not of a company you've heard of, but of a successful company that you haven't heard of, employing, let's say, 500 people. And the question is this really going to come to their doorstep? That was the idea that HBR told us. They don't want something that was just niche to only CEOs like Tim Cook. And so they politely declined the magazine article, but said, write this digital piece that'll disappear in a couple days or whatever. Of course, in 2017, when everything kind of became such a big deal, they came back to us, and now we have the article that Donna first identified, the new CEO activist, which came out in January in HBR. So now it's become sort of this cultural phenomenon. I think one thing we get credit for is sort of writing about it early, I guess, in 2015. I can't say that we've figured it out. It's changed a lot since then in terms of who's speaking out and how. But I will tell you, every time something like what happens with Dick's Clothing and Sporting Goods, sorry, I use the old name, I should say. I grew up in Binghamton, New York, which is the home of Dick's Clothing and Sporting Goods, the first original stores. Mr. Stack's father started the business down the road from my house. So I've been to the original stores. It used to be called Dick's Clothing and Sporting Goods. It's now Dick's Sporting Goods. Field and Stream, as we all know if we've been to Dick's, is the 35 stores that Dick's owns where they sold sort of ammunition and firearms. So that's what we're talking about here. When that happened, the media wants to have a story about it, and that's where my op-ed came from. And so they actually asked me to write that op-ed, and I was able to produce it, and they accepted it. And so every time one of these things happens, when someone steps off one of Trump's presidential counsels, like happened with Kenneth Frazier from Merck, you get those calls. Every time a CEO tweets about something, when Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank tweeted some sort of light praise for Trump, and then what happened is Stephen Curry, the #1 endorser for Under Armour, said, that's not my beliefs, and I disagree with it, then there was a retrenchment. And so anytime that happens with CEOs speaking out and getting involved in political stuff, now I'm getting called to kind of write or have an opinion on it. And frankly, I mean, to be honest, it's moved faster than we can really develop knowledge on it, because the Dick's thing I hadn't expected. I mean, obviously, the tragedy in Parkland is something you can't plan for, and seeing Dick's and Kroger and Walmart in quick succession, trying to understand what's going on has been difficult. So I will tell you what my working theories are for why. There's a lot of work to do. So I'm not coming up here, I think, with an answer. A lot of times I have lots of data. Most of my work is not like this. Most of my work, I have huge data sets with millions of firms, and I can run regressions, and I can tell you stuff. This is going to be a little different. This is going to be interviews I've done with folks, CEOs and others at these companies, sort of analysis of political data, but mostly what other people have done. And so I encourage you to ask me questions, help me refine this, because people are looking for an explanation. There's also this other thing, which I imagine some people in the room are interested in too, which is like, isn't this good or isn't this bad, right? And to tell you the truth, I'm happy to engage and talk about different perspectives on that. That hasn't been the purpose of my research. I think the question of is it good or is it bad, as an economist, is it good or bad for the world? Is it right or appropriate? I can tell you something about the bottom line for companies. But as an economist, I don't have a language or a framework to tell you whether it's good or bad for this to be happening. It's a society question, it's a philosophical question, it's a political question. I'll tell you what I've learned about it from talking to my students and teaching that class that I've done, because we had this debate, but that's not the focus of my research. So I'll go on and talk about it. Question? Yeah?
Just fill it in here.
Sure.
The names you mentioned are huge. We know them. Everybody
Yep.
knows them. But you say you've got millions of companies.
Oh.
How does this work out percentage-wise with
Yeah.
the rest of the field?
So let me clarify. Great question. So in my other research on entrepreneurship innovation, I'll do something like download the entire patent database of the United States and analyze millions of firms. For this topic on CEO activism, I don't have millions of data points. So this will be a very different kind of talk. I mean, honestly, most companies in the distribution are silent on these issues or speaking out, 15th or 16th, right, beyond the radar. These are famous companies speaking out, which is why I would say it's more of a case study approach, honestly, which has some advantages and disadvantages. But I don't have a million data points in this one. But I think what you'll find is a lot of diversity and a lot of people who are maybe not willing to always talk on the record about how they feel too, right? Interviews have a big disadvantage when you talk to someone about these topics, because are they willing to share with you exactly what they feel and why they're doing things? It's hard when the media spotlight is on you. So I'll tell you about some of the interviews that we're doing. We're going to interview this guy, Mark Benioff, on Thursday about Salesforce. So the first time we got to talk to him. We've interviewed Jim Rogers from Duke Energy, many people know in the audience. We've interviewed Bill Osterley from Indiana as well. And we're trying to get a few other interviews with some high-profile CEOs as well. You also see, most of the CEOs who have been speaking out during the time I've been studying this are from the progressive side of the ledger, right, at least on the issues. Bill Osterley might be a Republican, but he's speaking out on what's traditionally seen as a progressive issue. So there hasn't been as much ideological diversity on this in our world. We tried to interview other people, Dan Cathy, the Koch brothers, and we had some success, but not always. And it's hard to get these interviews with busy people. But I will say most of it has come from the progressive side of the spectrum on the issues so far, based on our analysis, which is largely right now not big data, but more anecdotal. Okay. So this was the Starbucks thing. So the question I've been trying to ask is, why do I think so many business leaders are doing this? One thing I should say is, it's really hard to know if something's increasing or decreasing or whether we just pay more attention to it. And so I've been trying for a long time to work with like LexisNexis, which is a database we use for all the newspaper articles, and trying to understand, is it more? I mean, CEOs are speaking out on prohibition in early American history. They were speaking out in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Coca-Cola among them. They filed amicus briefs related to issues around affirmative action in the 80s, the South Africa divestment issue. So, there's a long history of CEOs and companies getting involved. I mean, JP Morgan probably saved the United States economy back in the early 1900s, right? So I don't know how new this is because it's also what the media is covering, right? So I'm seeing a lot more instances of CEOs taking stands in the media because it's getting covered, but I don't know if it's reflecting an underlying change in their willingness to speak out. I think if I had to bet that something is changing, but I should say I don't know based on the data alone, because we don't know if it's happening more because we pay more attention or if it's actually happening. Yeah.
You mentioned the word activism, but I could not describe what Dick's Sporting Goods did as activism. There's another angle there. This inertia, this pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the day before the shooting, Dick was very fine with the NRA.
Mm-hmm.
The day after,
Yeah.
and I wonder, did they ever go to the board of directors or their shareholders?
That's a good question.
Before they make these, it looks like they just make it out of the blue.
I got some answers. Anthony, right? So yeah, because we had emailed before. They had told me. So Anthony and I emailed before. Maybe a Duke grad? Is that where you get those emails? Okay, so Anthony and I are on the same list, and a couple things on this. One is there's also differences within companies. So Anthony sent me an email from a report from Duke, which was that chief marketing officers, CMOs, other parts of the organization, they are actually pretty skeptical, according to this survey, of speaking out. They're worried about the hit on the brand. CEOs have seemed to be more forward on this. And then the question that Anthony's asking here is, are the right hand and left hand talking to one another? My experience so far is that they have not been, as a rule, talking to the board and engaging a bunch of stakeholders before making these decisions. There have been some exceptions. So I believe when Kenneth Frazier dropped off of the Trump advisory board, he did talk to the board. But in most cases, at least from best I can find out, they aren't doing this wide canvas. Now, why, when I ask them? It's like, you make all your other corporate decisions with so much thought and data. The media environment is happening quickly, and their argument to me has been that the typical news cycle is like 4 hours now. It used to be like a day, 4 hours. And so they have to make these rapid decisions, and the expectation is also changing, at least for some subset of their consumers. A recent survey said for millennials, they expect these companies to respond within 24 hours. So you think about how to canvas everyone you need to do in that short amount of time. So I think part of it's speed, and part of it is, I think, this idea that speaking out on Twitter is somehow different than making decisions on corporate policy, which may or may not be true, but I think people think that's different. And you see a lot of stuff being talked about on Twitter, even on our political side, right, which is it a statement of policy, or is it just part of the conversation? So I think those two things, from what I've seen, explain some of this. But they're not doing a careful, data-driven approach based on my experience. I don't think there's time, and I also don't think they have the data. I don't think they have the political data. So when Target decided to create new bathrooms in sort of support of the transgender bathroom issues that were coming up here, there was a petition with 600,000 people signed it in a very short amount of time that said, we're not going to go to Target anymore. So then Target basically retrenched that and spent $25 million creating single occupancy bathrooms. This obviates the whole thing, okay? Just go to the bathroom by yourself, right? So that was their answer. I don't think they had the data to predict, okay, here's how everyone feels, and it's going to be 50%. I mean, political pollsters and others might have that kind of stuff. My understanding of most companies, they don't yet have it, although they may seek to collect it. I think they're making it intuition, gut, and also in response to public pressure. And sorry, last point, and then I'll take this. Part of this is activism, which is Tim Cook talking about Indiana. Nobody necessarily asked him. Part of it is reactive, and I like the point you're making, which is companies responding to pressure. In my world, I'm talking about both, but I think that distinction is certainly clear. And some of this is reactive and some of it is activism. Sorry, go ahead.
So, related to that, has there been any role for corporate communications consultants and crisis management people? Most of these big corporations have those people on retainers or they're at a phone call away. Do they at least tap into that, or do they have to get involved after they get
Great question. So interestingly, a lot of the people who've invited me to speak over the last 2 years have been corporate communications teams and also public relations outside PR consultants. They're the ones who are most interested in this research actually from the beginning, which was interesting to me. There are two things. One is a lot of these CEOs do have their own Twitter account and manage it themselves. Not all, but some. That's not necessarily a best practice, as we can see among executives of all kinds, right? I mean, do you want them to control their Twitter account? Aren't we all asking? I mean, it's a hard question, right? But with both President Trump and these CEOs, think about what you're getting with Twitter, right? So while we might kind of say, oh gosh, why did they say that? Or they're also communicating directly with millions of people. And President Trump is, like him or not, whatever you want, he's used Twitter to great effect to communicate directly with people. And a lot of CEOs feel like that authenticity on Twitter is something you can't get with a corporate press release. So there's this tug of war, I find, between a lot of PR and internal communications teams with their own CEOs. I talked to one team, their CEO is on the East Coast, they're on the West Coast, or he ends up tweeting stuff before they even wake up. So can you imagine your job is to prevent this person from saying crazy things, and then they've already tweeted. So I think there's a tug of war. Some companies are much more, though, to your question, they're much more tight about it, and you're just not seeing their CEOs speak up. So I've asked a lot of CEOs in private, I can't quote them on the record, why aren't you speaking up? And they just have much more of a process. But a lot of their companies are asking me the question, which is, are we missing out on opportunities? So let me give you an example. Again, PayPal, agree or disagree. Nobody among my students knows anything about PayPal's corporate social responsibility movement. I mean, they do a lot, actually. No one knows anything. But everybody knows that they spoke out against HB2, and they were going to decline to open up that operations center. So think about it for a second in terms of these things you're doing on the social impact side. You're spending time and money and attention, programs on websites that no one ever reads, and think about one tweet or one decision and how salient that is. So on the flip side, some of those more careful corporate communicators are saying, are we missing out the chance to talk about our values to people? I'm just telling you the real debates, right? Agree or disagree. That's what I hear is going on. So, but they're trying to be more involved, I guess, is what I would say. Okay? Sure. Yeah.
Social re-engineering through the business sector.
Mm-hmm.
And as a business person, and as someone who oversees the North Carolina Museum of Art Foundation, I have employees that represent political views from a wide range.
Yeah.
I have donors who represent political views
Yeah.
from a wide range. I am notorious in the institution for my term, we are Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And walk that line carefully. I try to. It's an art museum. It's not a museum.
Yeah. Yeah. A Swiss art museum now, which is good. It's just good. I like.
But I see the social re-engineering, while I can appreciate why perhaps we have all got our individual values, individual perspectives. I believe I represent an employee base, a donor base, and a boards, plural, that indeed go across many
Sure.
sides of that.
If you're successful, hopefully you do have both of those, which is great.
Nor do I wish to be discriminatory against my employees because they have a different opinion
Mm-hmm.
And historically, and coming from the business school of
Yeah.
Ron back a few days,
Yeah. Yeah.
Post in Chapel Hill, this was unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
One did not engage in social engineering and
Mm-hmm.
activism at the CEO level.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the devil didn't take a position that had negative impacts potentially
Mm-hmm.
to your employees, to your donors, to
Mm-hmm.
your support mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
your sponsors, whatever, and discriminate in some
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing this go beyond just, oh, I'm a business leader and I have a personal opinion that I'd like to broadcast from my Twitter account.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're now seeing employees being let go because they have differences
Mm-hmm.
of opinions.
Mm-hmm.
We're stepping into labor law now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think this is a problem.
Yeah. No, so this is, we do get into this in my class. So I'll tell you about why I think it's happening first. But to your point, which is like, and by the way, your point is the one that the media wants to talk to me. I mean, when people are interested in this, they're interested in that, to be honest. They don't care that much about my why, but as an academic, I'm doing the why, okay, to be honest. Because, but to your point, this is why people want to talk to me about it. This is the emails I get. So it's just a huge part of the debate right now, which is, on one hand, maybe I can tell a story to kind of get this point across. So I teach a class at the Fuqua School with 3 sections of MBA students, and I pitch this to them after HB2. We do a case on HB2. And so for the students who generally are against HB2, so full disclosure, I poll the class, so I have all the data and all that stuff, and I don't think they'd mind me telling you, generally against HB2. But at the end, we ask this question, which is, well, are we only supportive of CEO activists when they're on our side? Right? The interesting discussion to have is, so if we're going to be upset on one hand about the Koch brothers, or name whatever on this side, right? And on the other hand, we're going to celebrate a Tim Cook, is that consistent? So one of the things I try to do in my class is kind of push for the consistency, right? If you think that business leaders should have free speech rights, they should be able to speak out all the time, and they should be able to use their influence to impact the democratic process in this way, then you have to be consistent on both sides, is what I'd say. The other thing is, I think if you're thinking about sort of this free market sense, as an economist trained to think about market forces a lot of my millennial students are really interested in working for some of these companies, and one of the questions they ask at these interviews is about the values question that you're actually talking about is really thorny, which is, does this company support my values? And it used to be kind of non-offensive corporate value kind of stuff. But what I see happening is, because politics is such a big part of a lot of people's lives, not everybody, it's now becoming that too. And now the question about values is like, well, if they're not standing up on this issue, I might not want to work for them. And now I'm seeing in this war for talent a lot of companies saying, oh my gosh, we got to recruit for all these young people, and that means we have to have something to say when they ask us about our policies and on these issues. So I feel like there's this market part where they're trying to respond to changing consumer tastes, changing employee issues, and because their employees are trying to hire MBAs from top business schools, it's going to skew a particular direction, right? It's not necessarily the most diverse in every case. On the other hand, right, the question is, where's this going? And so my New York Times piece is basically about that, which is, I think that rather than trying to come through the middle and solve these issues, these really thorny issues with a lot of pragmatic kind of compromises, CEOs kind of just end up on one side of the culture war or not. That's what I think is happening. And so it doesn't, and I think it's going to continue to happen that way. So I don't think with Dick's, for example, I'd be very interested to see if you get any difference in legislation because of what they've done versus just more back and forth. So anyway, that's how I've been thinking about it. The appropriateness of it, when I talk to my students, I feel like a lot of them have felt like they've been happy that these things have happened, partly because they feel like these points are not being heard by their democratically elected legislators. On the other hand, when I pitch the question like that, where I say, if it happened on the other side, and there was a democratically elected legislators in your state did it, and then it was changed, how would you feel? Then people do start to think about it differently. So that's at least been one of my goals, is try to tell people, okay, let's just be consistent about how we think about it. This thing's happening. Right now it might be happening more on your side versus the other. Or you would be happy if it goes both ways. And it's going to go both ways, let's be honest, because look at what Georgia just did to Delta, right? Delta spoke out, and Georgia said, hey, there goes your tax break, right? Patagonia spoke out. The House Natural Resources Committee said, Patagonia's lying to you, and they released an so this is, they're in the political sort of, this is what I try to put out in class. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the question there, you're saying they go their separate ways.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to solve an issue.
No. Yeah.
And so what do we accomplish when one gets in power, they put it their way, the tide shifts, the others in power, they undo everything that goes before
Yeah.
and changes it. When you come together, when you work on, I've done it on
Yeah.
pieces of legislation with both sides, they're solid, they're stable, and they work.
Yep.
So
But we're not.
that message out.
But I think at least I think the intention of a lot of business leaders, it depends probably, but some of them would love to come in that pragmatic role of brokering a compromise. I think a lot of them see themselves like this, right? But I think our underlying political polarization is making that middle ground that companies used to stand upon a little bit more tenuous. That's kind of been at least what, let me show you something on that. So a couple things. One is, I think conventional wisdom, you should be business leaders, should not be controversial. It's like you were saying again about like not taking these stands, particularly on behalf of your employees. Trade, education, taxes, these were safer areas to weigh in on. And we see things like trade associations, campaign contribution, lobbying. We have former electeds here, people who've worked, you know about this process. Okay? This was kind of the way it used to be working. Why do the CEOs speak out on a controversial social issue, and why does it seem to be happening more often? 3 reasons I've looked at. One is they feel more strongly about the issue, and they feel like they have special influence. You feel this a lot from CEOs, that they feel like, I've been given this position of power, and when I have power, it's kind of the Spider-Man rule, if you have comic book fans, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? Some people say hubris, but right, it depends on your view of what they're saying. Some people think it's great, some people think it's awful. So a lot of them feel compelled to speak out. They have power beyond what they imagine. They think, I got to say something on behalf of employees or whoever. Some people are more cynical about it, by the way. They just say it's marketing and PR. Ross Duhat in New York Times had an article basically saying this, that it's basically just marketing and PR. It's not about convictions. That's the other thing. And it's often a heady mix of both, right? You're doing the analysis in one hand, but you also feel strongly about the issue. So these are kind of the things we've been talking about. So this is my working theory. I call it my working theory, so I'm interested. And you all recognize everyone on this, right? Michael Jordan and Harvey Gantt. You remember when Harvey Gantt was running for the Senate in North Carolina, made a lot of waves that race against Jesse Helms, right? And they asked, apparently, Michael Jordan to get involved. And Michael Jordan, again, he's now said he didn't say this, so I don't want to ascribe it to him. So let's just call it the AKA Michael Jordan rule, because he might not have said this. But the quote is, Republicans buy sneakers too. This was the idea that why would I want to get involved in a political process, right, and alienate a big part of my consumer base, which is kind of the idea of being Switzerland in these kinds of things. And they usually just stuck to kind of inoffensive corporate social responsibility programs. I mean, who can be against investing in our community? I mean, you know, I talked to folks from the Chicago School, Milton Friedman acolytes, who are saying they're against this, but it's a more polite debate. It's like, you know, we're diverting shareholder wealth to spend on these silly programs. But in general, most of the CSR stuff doesn't offend that many people, or it's pretty small dollar, okay, in the end of the day. Bland mission statements, that, I mean, how can you disagree with investing in our people? I mean, what, you know, that's kind of like boilerplate. But now, I think, depending on your demographics, your political ideology, a lot of people think this is the good old days. But I do think there's a lot of folks who are embracing these new activist CEOs too. I mean, it wouldn't be happening otherwise. So what's happening? So one is, I think political polarization is a big part of it. I mean, I think you can't talk about CEOs in isolation. So this is from Pew, 2014, but the trend is correct, which is, this looks at the median Democrat and the median Republican in their survey in terms of how close they were on different issues. And you can see that 94, and this is, I mean, people know this in the audience, this is when Newt Gingrich came to power. This is a time, I remember as a kid, people were saying, oh, politics is changing, you know, we're going to get very divided. But this was 94, where the median Democrat and median Republican are pretty close on these 10-point scales in terms of ideology. 2004, it starts to widen a little bit. By 2014, you see huge differences between the median Republican and the median Democrat in terms of their political views. This has been happening. Most political scientists have documented it. More political polarization. But it's deeper than that. I want to show you a couple other things. This goes to our US Senate. This is in 1989. This map, this blur with purple, is basically the number of times that a Republican and Democrat vote together. So the idea is if I vote and Fred votes and I'm a Republican and he's a Democrat, we create a node, right, or a tie when we vote together on bills. And that was happening a lot in 1989. But by 2013, I mean, there's almost 2 different blotches, right? We're very unlikely, and you've seen this, you all read the news, you guys are more plugged into this than anybody, I'm sure. There's not a lot of sort of overlap on these bills. As you said, a lot of partisan voting. So it's coming in the Senate, but coming from the voters as well, okay? Then, I find this really interesting. Who cares the most? Who's the most politically engaged? If you're a marketer inside a company, you're looking for your most reliable consumers. And political movements are looking for the people who are most consistent, the people who are calling the senator and congressman, the people who are voting in the midterm elections, those who are voting in midterm primary elections. I mean, this is the hardcore group, and I think a lot of us are in that group because we care about this stuff. We're spending our lunchtime talking about it, but we're the minority. Don't forget that we're really the weird ones on both sides, okay? So, but look at this. Us weirdos who really care, we're, among Republicans and Democrats, we're much more likely, 70% of us are most likely to be consistently conservative. And again, right, with the Democrats, they're much more likely to be consistently liberal. So 33% of the hardcore people are consistently conservative, and the rest are mostly conservative. So you see these polls at either side, which represent the people who are the most intensely engaged are among the most divided. It'd be one thing if everyone in the middle was kind of the people who are most intense and divided. What the data seems to be showing is the most engaged Democrats and the most engaged Republicans are the most partisan and ideological. And that's bad news for polarization, if you think that's a bad thing, because those are people who are calling and influencing and pushing things on either side. You'll see where I'm going to get here. Last thing. This is shocking. I don't know how many people have seen this one. So this is about how much you fear the other side. Fear is a strong word. Fear is like, I fear, hopefully, very few things in my life, But if you look at the percent of Republicans, and we'll have the same thing for Democrats, who say the Democratic Party makes them feel afraid, 50% almost, and among the high political engagement, the people who are into it, us weirdos, 62% are afraid of the other side. On the Democratic side, 70% of the high political engagement are afraid of the other side. So think about that. I mean, physically afraid, like an existential threat to you. Now think about how hard you would fight for these things and how much you would wake up every day if you're actually afraid that if someone gets elected, your life is in danger. I mean, this is essentially, fear is a strong word. Now again, they use this they give them a choice of words: afraid, angry, frustrated. Afraid is on there. And so I think this is what we call this idea of negative partisanship. So it's not just much like I carry the flag for the Yankees and John carries the flag for the Red Sox and we both are passionate about our team. I actually think worse of Red Sox fans. I'm afraid of Red Sox fans. And he is afraid of Yankee fans. Right, you guys got those green monsters. I don't know what's in there, right? So this is an interesting dynamic that's been coming up in a lot of the research, which I think is interesting. Not my research, secondary political science research and stuff from places like Pew, replicated in most surveys. I don't think it's a sort of an outlier or something like that. I mean, it could, I don't think it is. The other thing is the anti-vote. So it's like, how many people vote for Trump because they didn't want Hillary to win? How many people voted for Hillary because they didn't want Trump to win? Large percentages, bottom line, okay? So this whole idea of trying to sort of, I feel good when UNC loses if I'm a Duke fan. I feel good when Duke loses if I'm a UNC fan. So you have that dynamic. At the same time, you have ideological polarization among the people who are most involved, and you have our senators and congressmen following lead. That, to me, is what I think is driving some of this. There's one part of this extra, which is political identity salience. Okay, now, it's not just that we feel strongly about this stuff. It'd be one thing if, look, okay, we go to church together, right? Our kids go to the same school, and third or fourth on the list is you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. That's a different view than I'm a Democrat comes first, okay? And what we're finding in a lot of the research is that political identity is becoming more salient for people. If you ask me what the first thing you want to know about me is, it's my political views. If you look at my Facebook page, you'll see who I like and I don't like. And it's much more tied not to these universal community anchors like a church or a school, but to my political candidates. And so we're finding even brands kind of become more Democratic or Republican by who buys them. Great paper if you're a glutton for punishment to read a bunch of sociology articles, which I do like. American Journal of Sociology, Why Liberals Drink Lattes. And it's so interesting. So look, full disclosure, a lot of us like lattes, okay? Like everyone, right? There's no reason why a latte is a liberal thing, just like there's no reason that wearing camouflage is a Republican thing. It doesn't make any sense. What's happening to us is, though, we're sorting into these like lifestyle choices. Like what kind of, like driving a Hummer makes you a Republican, and driving a Prius makes you a Democrat. These things, these sociologists are really good at this kind of thing. They're pointing out this stuff has no like actual underlying ideology in and of itself. But what happens is we see these as signals. People like me are driving Priuses. I'm going to drive a Prius. That guy I don't like with the Trump sign on his yard, he drives a Hummer, I'm not driving a Hummer, right? That is how we make these decisions, and we're becoming more segmented such that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and now liberals drink lattes, right? And conservatives wear camouflage, or conservatives go to Cracker Barrel, and liberals are now going to go to Field and Stream. And so this stuff becomes amplified when we make these lifestyle choices, and I think this is what's actually getting behind a lot of the CEO activism, the why. Not to answer this woman's question, but more about the why, okay? So, yeah. Question? Yeah, go. Yeah, go. Sure.
Is it intentional? So Visa, Coca-Cola, Google, and Apple are in both.
Yes, and there are some brands. Yeah, some brands. Okay, so I thought about this a little bit. So yeah, some brands might be smart. Some brands are trying to appeal to all, the mass market. It's hard though because a lot of brands are getting tugged in one direction or another to take a stand on these things. The other brands that are actually in both are brands like Facebook, Twitter, and PayPal. They're platforms, though, so that's the key. They're not selling us one Visa card or even a menu. They're selling us a platform for us to express our political identity, essentially. What you're finding in those platforms, I wrote about this in the Times, Twitter and PayPal have faced a lot of criticism about political bias now, because what they're trying to do is clean up their platforms, in their view, trying to eliminate fake news. But what happened when Twitter did this is that they cracked down on a lot of conservative commentators. So now there's all this talk about alternative Twitter, right, for conservatives. PayPal tried to crack down after Charlottesville on a bunch of white nationalists and alt-right groups, but then now there's been a whole other sort of payment mechanism set up for people who are left out of PayPal. So when you try to kind of divide or sort of change your platform to kind of a wrong community standards, sometimes you alienate people. Some brands like Coke can do it, right? But I think that's fewer than it was before, at least from what I'm seeing. A lot of the marketers are doing more work on this, and it changes over time. But some brands can make it, and a lot, I guess, can't. That's kind of what I'm seeing.
That's happening in a lot of areas. AARP has an
course.
alternative, and
Of course.
TPG has an alternative.
Of course.
It's kind of-
Yeah, and for all of us in the room, I mean, think about a world, though, where we don't have any of those community institutions or organizations that tie us all together. Like, before my time, right, it was the Rotary Club and the Legion and things like that, right? A lot of bowling leagues. Robert Putnam talked about this in his books, right? What do we lose when we lose these things that we used to kind of socialize together with people who are different than us? And that, to me, the one editorial comment I can make is like, that's worrying to me as an American, just because if I see this division, I understand different political beliefs, but if we lose this public square where we're even having conversations, which it might have happened at the AARP, it might have happened if we were members of like a club together, but that doesn't seem to be happening in most people's lives, and especially on social media where you're supposed to be connected to everyone, but you're actually just connected to people who are like you or yelling at you who you don't even really like, right? So I mean, and social media has not been good for this. Ironically, when we got started with social media, everyone said, this is going to connect people that you've never connected to. It's going to be amazing. It's actually just sucked us apart. And, right? I mean, think about it. We live in a world of like you can connect to anyone. You can find your friends from high school and reconnect with them, but we're more divided than ever, right? And that's sort of interesting to me too, and you think about the way people use these platforms. Yeah, go ahead.
You may be going to get to this.
No problem.
You looked at the specific economic impact
Mm-hmm.
of a CEO decision
Yeah.
to come out progressive or to come out conservative,
Mm-hmm.
and analyze what happens to their market share
Yeah.
as a result.
I did. And let me show you one with Apple real quick. Let me just check time here to make sure I'm okay. Okay, good. Let me show you that real quick. So my story, and then I'll show you the study that we actually did. Political polarization in the U.S. is increased dramatically. More differences between Dems and Republicans, left and right. More ideological sorting. Back in the day, you'd have conservatives who were Democrats and liberals who were Republicans. Rockefellers, for example. Politics becomes more like a permanent war between red and blue, small and vocal armies aligned on both sides. And our political identities matter more to us. So on Tinder, which I don't think anyone in this room is on, thank goodness, right? But Tinder, right, swipe left if you feel a Trump supporter. The idea being, it's like, I don't want to even date people or even socialize with people who are Trump supporters. So there's this idea of like, I don't want to have those conversations. In this environment, everything is becoming politicized. Business, sports, right, community organizations. So my next set of work, we're interviewing not just CEOs, heads of sports leagues, religious leaders, nonprofit heads, people across all sectors, military, to talk to about how the politicization of everything is affecting them. Because it's quite difficult for people who haven't been used to doing this. One great interview from this is with Robert Zimmer, who's the president of the University of Chicago, talking about free speech and how campus is changing. University professors and presidents have a big issue here. Companies have always been deeply involved in politics, but now there's increased attention on everything they do, demands for transparency about what they do and who they support. The result here is a new playbook for CEOs and leaders of all kinds, whether they want to or not. That's been kind of my point, because if you don't respond, social media is like a microphone that's always on. That's what I've found. And so if you don't respond to the crisis of the day, then it's almost as good as having no opinion. And that's where a lot of companies are getting blowback. So let me take a question from Anthony, and then I'll get to your question about the study.
Have you met with a group of CEOs? Because what they've done is they've allowed a monster to run their business.
Mm-hmm.
They have.
Mm-hmm.
They have to come here and look. This is a new dynamic. You mentioned social media.
Yeah.
You mentioned look what the bots are doing.
Yeah.
Last week, Mike Huckabee resigned from CMA.
Yeah.
Only because he has a Bible-based belief about homosexuality.
Yeah.
The Halloween, in one day, they went after him. So they're looking for anybody, and they're intolerant. And the CEOs have to understand they're feeding the monster.
So this is interesting, though. So what kind? I think it's taking a step back and thinking about it. You might see CEOs and companies be more strategic, but these decisions, as we talked about earlier, aren't being made with kind of in a strategic way. They're just being made to respond to a particular crisis, especially the reactive stuff. So I think I could be wrong. This has changed really fast the last 3 years. I think you'll probably see more of this rather than less of this. That's for now. Maybe there'll be some big sort of break in the trend. But I mean, the recent thing over Parkland with Dick's and Walmart and Kroger, I mean, shocked even. I thought that was, I was not expecting that. Okay, and so that I think we'll see more and more of these. Let me show you the study that this gentleman asked about real quick. Let me actually make sure I get there. I don't want to skip typical class here. So yes, okay. So what we did is we looked at Indiana and RFRA. Okay, Governor Pence signed that into law March 26th. Tim Cook did the opposition on March 27th. 1 week later, the Indiana legislature revised the law and Pence signed it. And this is the picture of the original bill signing. Okay, so what did we do? We looked at Twitter and we looked at Tim Cook's comments. This is what he said. This is in the Post, I'm sorry. A wave of legislation introduced in more than 2,000 states would allow people to discriminate against their neighbors. Does he really deserve credit for them repealing the law? So I'm on the board of a market research company that works with a lot of different websites, and we put these internet polling questions all over the internet. And the nice thing is we work with the AARP, we work with the NRA, we work with all sorts of different companies, and we put these questions on people's websites for a wide variety, left, right. The idea is to get better data. So we're not affiliated or supporting any of those organizations, but we want to get as much data from different people as we can. So put these questions on here, and just in the interest of time, I can show you a couple of these questions. This is right after the Indiana law. So we asked people, were you aware that Indiana recently passed a law about religious freedom? 84% of our respondents were. I'll save you the details. We get a nationally representative sample. We do lots of weighting to make sure people answering internet surveys are representative. We've thought a lot about this. I can't get into detail. Happy to talk offline. But in the interest of time, you can take these as estimates based on a national sample. Okay? Do you support Indiana's new law protecting religious freedom? 39% yes, 39% no, 22% not sure. Then we give another random group. Okay, we asked them, they recently passed a law about religious freedom, and some believe the law may allow discrimination against gays and lesbians in that state. Do you support the law? Note the difference between these two. I'm talking about the same law, RFRA. In one, I framed it differently. I framed it the way Tim Cook has framed it, not as the legislators in Indiana. And this changed, and this is statistically significant. I can show you this another time, I guess. 35%, yes, it goes down. Many, many more people are actually saying no. Why? I think it's clear. When you put discrimination in the prompt, I mean, this is a tried and true thing in any polling. Nobody wants to be for that. And so even the group that was unsure here is popping into the no. Okay, so key thing is framing to start. Okay, do we understand what I'm doing? Okay, so how likely are you to buy Apple products in the near future? And then I'm going to ask that same question to another set of, let's say, 2,000 people. Apple CEO Tim Cook recently said this about the religious freedom law. He believes it will allow discrimination against gays and lesbians. How likely are you to buy Apple products in the near future? So I did exactly what you're asking. Then I wanted to give a Tim Cook quote that had nothing to do with politics, because you might say, you mentioned Tim Cook and people just want to buy more Apple stuff, right? A standard trick in psychology is about salience and remembering things. So I gave another group of 2,000 people a random Tim Cook quote about business. Management philosophy is to focus on people, strategy, and execution. By the way, for those who run businesses, is there anything else? People, strategy, I came up with the best thing I could. What's really interesting, though, is when you kind of put this in the prompt about religious freedom and discrimination, you do see more people being very likely or likely to want to buy Apple products. Big flaw of the study that we can't do anything about. I can't track these people. With the internet, I mean, I can get cookies and I can look to see what they answer later. I can't follow them to the Apple store and right. So survey response bias, I haven't solved that. But at least in survey data, and this is to your point, there's no other empirical evidence that I know of people actually measuring how much this matters. So we found, at least with Tim Cook, with Apple, on RFRA, it seems like people are more willing after they hear from Cook to buy Apple products. We broke down that group a little bit, and we found it's mostly people who already agree with Tim Cook on the issue of same-sex marriage. So one question you might ask is, how does this work out with the audiences? At least in this study, I don't want to generalize too much. When Tim Cook speaks out about RFRA, people who are already supportive of his politics and against RFRA, like Apple more likely to buy Apple. People who are against, they're against, but they don't necessarily decrease their intention enough to balance it out. So just like every other debate in American politics, it's a lot about intensity. And so one thing to think about is when CEOs are speaking out, it might not even be to change the underlying issue. It might just be to signal that we stand with you, whoever you is, making the calculation that that stand is going to engender more consumer sort of sentiment and also attract future employees, because a lot of my students are paying attention to this stuff too, and these are the kind of folks who are going to work at Apple. Let me take a couple questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So that's what my question was, are you noticing a generational difference of opinion?
I do.
Millennials seem to really like this, whereas our generation is just make a good computer.
Yeah. based on my experience in my class, so I just taught 200 students, and I did this case, essentially. And my students are not perfectly representative, but let me show you one thing here. So this is a couple things for Patagonia, right? You remember this? And then this is the response from the Republicans of the House, Papa John's. Okay, so let's see. I'll show you one thing here. So millennials, I mean, my class is mostly liberal students. But then millennials who have college degrees are mostly liberal. So in some sense, I mean, we made that apparent, but then my class looks like the underlying. Based on my sample of 200, they are much more welcoming of CEO activism than I think I've heard in the room, and that doesn't surprise me. When I go speak at different audiences, there's a lot more skepticism for the reasons that have been articulated by this woman and others. So I do see a generational divide. I'm not sure if I can generalize beyond that, but I do see that. So exactly what you're thinking about. Go ahead.
Tell me if I'm all wet, but one thing I seem to have noticed, and it goes to this intensity thing, and maybe also to the generational difference, is that there's been a shift, especially in academia, from vocally expressing opinions to enforcing those opinions, right? To trying to shut down the other side, right? So for instance, a freshman volunteer for Environmental Club recruited people to be on a panel discussion talking about sea level during the Great North Carolina Sea Level debate.
Yeah, yeah.
And I am on the board of an organization which supported the North Carolina Sea Level bill. And when the higher ups discovered that I was going to be on that panel, a couple of days before it was scheduled to happen, the debate was canceled. The panel discussion was canceled, and we were told it was because nobody on the other side could be found to participate, and they didn't want it to be one-sided. Now, understand it was those professors on the other side at Duke who led the lobbying effort in the legislature.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
It was. I see that. I mean, and we're starting to see that show up in corporate activism, with PayPal threatening not build their facility because of a conservative bill in North Carolina. And is that happening? Is that just my imagination, or is that becoming?
No, it's a huge issue on campus. No, it's a longer discussion, but let me tell you one thing. Talking to Robert Zimmer at University of Chicago, there is diversity at different schools about this. So I'd say read the Chicago Principles. Robert Zimmer has taken a lot of flack and he's got a lot of praise, but he's basically trying to take on, kind of from the point you're talking about, trying to encourage free speech at campus and make sure different ideas don't get shut down. And there's other schools that have had different views about this, right? The idea that they're, like, for example, you want to invite like a controversial speaker like Richard Spencer, right? The idea is, should he come to campus or should he not? When he comes to campus, you got like hundreds of thousands of dollars of security, people protesting on each side. So Zimmer's saying we should be able to invite who we want to campus, and free speech is the most important thing. Other groups are saying other schools are making different decisions. So I would say that your topic is hot on campus, different schools, different views. And we'll talk more offline with some others, because that takes more questions. But yeah, I will. I just want to make sure I get more people. Can we take till 1:05? Is that okay? Or no? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Let's see, I was thinking about traditionally conservatives haven't boycotted stuff. I don't know if that's changing or not. But I wonder if in the past, or currently, that people on the progressive side think, well, we're not taking much of a risk with conservatives, and we're not,
Right.
but with progressives we're gaining.
Yeah.
And along with that, it seems like conservative CEOs typically haven't taken the stand. You said that.
Yeah, I haven't seen as much of it.
And like even with the Chick-fil-A, what Dan Cathy said,
Yeah.
he didn't say as
Yes.
the president of Chick-fil-A, but yes, there was a big boycott
Yes.
and all that kind of stuff. And that,
Yeah.
it seems like I don't have any problem with CEOs giving their own money. I have trouble with Tim Cook giving Apple's money.
Yep.
Because I'm an Apple consultant.
Yeah.
So I have trouble with.
You need a boycott though, right? See, you're not. You're like, yeah.
So it seems like there's some of that going on. I don't know if that's going to change. I've heard some conservatives saying, "Oh, we've
Yep.
got a boycott now." And I'm like,
No, excellent points. I have not seen the same kind of boycotts. You are seeing these boycotts, they call them. So after the Chick-fil-A thing, Huckabee and former Senator Rick Santorum organized like a boycott to go to Chick-fil-A on those days. So I think you see that. Secondly, I think you're right. I have not seen so many conservative CEOs speaking out. And the difference, the Dan Cathy and they are a little bit different, because Cathy made this comment on a radio show. It's a privately owned firm. I mean, there's another huge difference here, right? Privately owned firm where I think his family, I could be wrong, has the majority ownership of the company. So that's different. The Koch brothers, through their private foundations mostly, in a family-owned business, as I remember. So there's just differences. But I have not seen conservative CEOs speaking out as much. We're trying to interview more folks and talk to them. I think It could be that they have a different style. It could be that they don't feel it'd be beneficial. I haven't got to that, honestly. It's hard to ask people those questions, but that's what we're trying to do. Mostly from the I don't think you're missing it, though. And I think the boycotts what I've seen more than the boycotts. I'll take a couple more quick ones. Yeah, go ahead.